Hello, I am Isidoros Parlamas, and I would like to talk about the geopolitical situation in the next couple of years. Let's take a look. This is the geopolitical forecast uh, from 2023 to 2024. Geopolitical conflicts and quality of life. A hesitant and tepid West. First, the Russian-Ukrainian war, which is ongoing. Second, the Greek-Turkish conflict, including Cyprus, which is imminent. Third, NATO crisis, Russian-Turkish alliance, ongoing for all practical purposes. 4. Azeri-Armenian conflict, Nagorno-Karabakh, imminent. 5 and 6. Israeli-Arab and Israeli-Iranian conflicts. 7. Serbo-Kosovo-Albanian conflict, imminent. 8. Chinese-Taiwanese conflict. 9. North Korean-South Korean conflict. 10. Possible Chinese-Japanese conflict. 11. Migrant and refugee crisis. 12. Latin American narco-states. 13. Political upheaval and instability in the EU and the US, Hungary, Trumpism, and others. Now, what would you do if you were Putin? You would wish to weaken the West. And how can that be achieved? By forcing the West to have to deal with multiple crises at the same time. Crisis 1. The Russian-Turkish alliance is already ongoing, and it is certain that the Russians will push the Turks, not that they need to be pushed, but will push the Turks to start a war against Greece and Cyprus, which will undoubtedly trigger a NATO crisis. That is imminent. The Turks will not consent to approving Sweden and Finland's accession to NATO. Crisis number 2. The Russians and the Serbs have already planned an attack on Kosovo, imminent. It follows that NATO and the US will have to deal with 3 fronts in Europe simultaneously. 1 in Ukraine, 2 in the Aegean and East Mediterranean, Greece and Cyprus versus Turkey, and 3 in the Balkans, Serbia, Kosovo. Crisis number 3. The Turks and the Azeris will attempt to take advantage of the upheaval to uproot the 150,000 Armenians from Nagorno-Karabakh, which is an Armenian enclave surrounded by Azerbaijan, imminent. Crisis number 4. What would you do if you were China Sea? You would invade Taiwan, knowing that NATO and the US would be far too busy to even attempt to protect it. It should happen before the end of 2024. Crisis 5. The same goes for North Korea's Kim. Kim is expected to boost production of nuclear weapons to keep the pressure on South Korea and thus further weaken the West's resolve and power, already ongoing. Crisis 6. Japan, sensing that China will almost certainly succeed in annexing Taiwan, has already started drawing up plans for massive armaments and total militarization of the country. In approximately 3 years from now, I expect to see the first manifestations of that conflict. Crisis 7. The Israeli-Arab conflict and the Israeli-Iranian conflict have been ongoing for many years now, which adds even more burden to the West's resources, ongoing. Crisis 8. The Latin America narco-states have been contributing in multiple ways for decades now to the West's economic as well as ethical wear and tear at a terribly high cost, ongoing. Crisis 9. Deep-rooted political corruption and politicking have been causing upheaval and instability in the EU and the US, Hungary, Trumpism, etc., ongoing. Crisis 10. The weaponization of the migrant and refugee crisis by the Russians and the Turks have been eroding further the cohesion in the EU, ongoing. Let me read this now. For months, before the Russians invaded Ukraine, Russian troops were amassing along the Ukrainian border, and we knew that the Russians would invade. If I knew it, the West knew it too. If 50,000 NATO troops had entered Ukraine before the Russians invaded, the Russians would have never invaded Ukraine, and the West knew that. But the West did nothing. Why? Because the West wanted the Russians to invade Ukraine. Why? Because the West believed that would be the beginning of the end of nuclear-armed Russia. The West is hoping that some sort of Russian opposition will topple Putin's regime from within, and that a new Russian regime friendly to the West will assume power. It remains to be seen if the West's hopes will materialize, which is a big if loaded with a very real nuclear risk. However, the real threat to the West is not nuclear Russia or China or Iran, but rather the unspeakable depth of corruption in the US and to a lesser extent, not too much lesser, in the EU. In a few words, the West is already rotten and the stench has spread around the world. Now, if you add to that the stench of the regimes controlled by strongmen like Russia, Belarus, Turkey, China, North Korea, Iran, then the quality of life will certainly suffer a lot in the next decade. The West's equivalent of strongman-controlled states are the pseudo-democratic institutions such as parliaments, congresses, senates, judiciaries, governments, legislative, judicial, and executive. All in tandem, which along with the police are oh so corrupt. It is called abuse of power, handed to those who serve in the institutions by naive electorates. The West has been too hesitant and tepid in dealing with the strongmen and dictators it is facing. If it is to succeed and avert an all-out nuclear war, the West must assume a much more assertive stance soon. So the real problem is that those people who serve in the government, in an extending sense of the word, are all corrupt, each and every single one of them. Now, if there is 1 in 10,000 who is not corrupt, it is difficult to identify them. So the problem is corruption. And if the West wishes to save itself, it should address corruption first, and then other states which also pose a threat to it. That's what I wanted to say. Thank you very much. Bye.